On this day, 23rd of February, 1944, deportation of the Chechen and English peoples begins. Up to 700,000 people would be deported from their homes in the Caucasus to Central Asia and to Siberia. Possibly as many as 400,000 would perish during this forced deportation. The Chechen people are a very ancient group. There are some who maintain that they originally came from the Fertile Crescent, so from Ur and Summer and all of that. There are some that say that part of them migrated from the Fertile Crescent, or that they went to the Fertile Crescent and then came back at some point. But there is definitely some, or thought to be some sort of connection between Fertile Crescent and the Chechen people. 3,000 years of history are contained in the mountain state in which they live. And like most mountain people, whether Pashtuns, Pathans, Gurkhas, Highland Scots or Swiss, they are fiercely independent, aggressive to outside interference, and egalitarian societies. There have been many different types of Chechen states that have come and gone, and because they live in the mountains, they have been more able to resist than the peoples of the plains. The Russians were completely destroyed when the Mongols conquered Kievan Rus and the post-Kievan Russian principalities. The Chechens were one of the very few that were able to resist the Mongol invasion twice, although their state was destroyed, but they were able to hold out in the mountains and push the Mongols out. The mountains gave them refuge, and for much of their history they remained aloof and away from entanglements with other empires. The Persians, the Turks, and the Russians at various points tried to conquer them, tried to subdue them, but one by one they resisted, and they usually came out on top, with the Turks and the Persians not really trying very much. The Russians were different. The Russians were expanding southwards, and at first they were more concerned with defeating the Persians and the Turks, but at some point those stubborn mountain men would have to come to heel. Between 1818, so this is just after the Napoleonic Wars, and 1861, a series of conflicts, wars, what by modern standards would be called acts of genocide, took place between the Chechens and the Russians. Grozny, the capital of Chechnya now, was originally a Russian fort to guard against Chechen raids into the lowlands. Eventually, the Russians won. It's said that about half, that's for later on, most of the Chechens alive then perished during these wars, and about 40,000 were expelled into Turkey. This is around the same time of the Circassian genocide. Genocide is a very new name. They wouldn't call it genocide back then. But they were another Muslim group, Caucasian Muslim group, in the lower parts of the Caucasus Mountains, a bit more north of Chechnya. And they were, conquered as well. Most of them, up to 1 million, were expelled or killed. And there are still a smattering of them around, but not very many in modern-day Russia. Most of them who exist are now in modern-day Turkey, or around the Middle East, former Turkish territories where they were settled. So this was something that the Russians were doing at the time. They were crushing these little countries because they were resisting their expansion. And you can't have that when you're expanding. So after 1861, the Chechens were defeated. They did rebel a few times, but their first successful rebellion, you could say, was during the Russian Civil War. However, inevitably, just like everyone else, the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the various Central Asians in Turkestan, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Georgians, they all eventually came back under the rule of Moscow. And during the 20s and 30s, there was resistance against Stalin's regime, against him trying to root out religion, and against the collectivization. But Stalin being Stalin, they were quite brutal, and especially brutal to the Chechens. He didn't have much time for them. The Second World War comes along, and the Germans are invading the Soviet Union. In 1942, the Chechens actually start a rebellion. Well, 1940 actually, they started the rebellion because they saw the Finns resist the Soviets, and they thought, if they can do it, we can do it. But it wasn't until 1942 when this became a threat. The Chechen state, or the ASSR, the Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic within the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, had some oil in the northern part, the flat part, which was mostly settled by Russians, and they were also on the way to Baku, the great oil metropolis of the Soviet Union. In 1942, Operation Blue, Germans actually took a town in Chechnya, which was an oil town. They held that's as far as they got. They never actually got as far as the Chechen inhabited part of Chechnya, and apparently only about 100 Chechens fought for the Axis, and many more fought for the Soviets. 17,000 fought for the Soviets. They got about 44 medals for their bravery, but this was not going to save them. The rebellion from 1940, it was a small rebellion. Probably wouldn't have even been recorded in history if it hadn't been for this deportation. It was used by Stalin and Beria as justification to deport the entire country. 1942 into 1943, the Germans were expelled from that part of Russia, back towards the Don River. This would leave the Chechens open to Soviet reprisals. Laurenti Beria was the head of the NKVD, future KGB. He was a great ally and supporter of Stalin, someone who wrote a book lionizing Stalin just to get into his good books. He was also from Georgia and for a while ruled Georgia with an iron fist. This impressed Stalin, as did the book, which flattered Stalin and made him out to be more than he actually was in the Bolshevik movement before the revolution. Laurenti Beria was an evil, sadistic, murdering rapist. One of his favorite things to do was to go around Moscow, have beautiful young women kidnapped, some of them, many of them, under what we would call now underage. Beautiful young girls, he'd bring them to his house, and if they did not consent to have sex with him, he would rape them, and many times he would kill them. And they would be buried in his garden, or they'd be dumped in the streets. He enjoyed this, and being the head of the police, being head of the NKVD, he could do whatever he wanted. The other communists knew this about him. Some of them, were probably disgusted by it. Maybe they said later on they were disgusted by it. But no one actually challenged him. This was a man who enjoyed torture, rape, murder, sadism, and this did not end at innocent individuals wandering around Moscow, or people that were on the NKVD's list of suspicious political people. It also extended to ethnic groups, to the kulaks, to Polish officers that they seized in 1940 and killed in Katyn. He was very happy murdering tens of thousands of people, or at least ordering their murder. And in 1944, he convinced Stalin to deport the entire nation of Chechnya, as well as the English, who were very closely related to the Chechens. And in many ways, there was no reason for it. There had been a small rebellion, but it was not it wasn't burning in the mountains, and they weren't defeating Soviet armies, and they were not allying themselves with the Germans. But this didn't really matter. Truth doesn't really matter to someone like Beria. It doesn't really matter to communists, really. They just lie through their teeth about everything. I think it was someone that said that about communism and how people consider that it was perverted. But there was a guy called Olavo de Carvalho said communism is not a great ideal that has been perverted. It is a perversion that has sold itself as a great ideal. And I think this is epitomized in the person of Laurenti Beria. Anyway, deporting the entire nation of Chechnya. Now, there are some debates about exactly how many. The Soviets had to use 19,000 officers, as well as 100,000 NKVD soldiers to do this. So there's been 120,000 men. The Soviets think it was about 496,000 Chechen and English. The Chechens say it was nearer to 650,000, and somewhere in the region of a quarter perished. The Chechens say that up to 400,000 died, so it's hard to know exactly how many died or how many were deported, because who knows? They're not going to tell you, and the official documents, they're probably lies anyway. But even if we just take the official statistics, 496 and a quarter of them died, still 120,000 dead, just because they're being deported. And they were deported in cattle trucks, just as the Jews were, from all over Europe towards the camps in Poland. Cattle trucks going thousands of miles into the east. Many of these people were elderly or young or sick, and they would die. So I'm not surprised that that many died. The entire republic was emptied. They were sent to modern-day Kazakhstan. into Siberia, and they would stay there for 13 years. Stalin was without mercy. The Chechen people, after being deported from their homes, suffered immensely. They were dumped into places that they were unfamiliar with. Many of them dumped in the middle of the cold winter, where they had to try to survive or die. Many died from the transportation alone, being stuck on those cattle cars for days, or even longer. It would have been a horrific experience, and many people, even now in Chechnya, consider that that scar has never really gone away, and I'm not really surprised. Obviously, something like this would probably have an effect on your view of the Central Russian state. So probably, you can kind of get why rebellions have happened, and why there have been various wars, and there's been terrorism, and I'm not justifying it, but if your grandparents went through that, it might be easier to justify doing a horrible thing. Stalin and Beria and all their associates didn't do much good in this world. So, the great story of Stalin and Beria ends 1953. Stalin dies, very famous story where he has some sort of stroke or fit, hard to know what it was, but he was incapacitated. People were afraid to wake him up because he liked getting drunk and staying in bed late, and so no one really wanted to go and disturb him. By the time someone did, they realized something was wrong, and then it took a few hours for them to get doctors out. Beria had a kind of love-hate thing with Stalin, and he was kind of hoping that he would die, and then when Stalin would open his eyes, he'd be like, "Oh, I love you, Stalin, oh, please get better, blah, blah, blah." And then he'd go back, he'd close his eyes again, and go, "Oh, great, that's evil." Beria was positioning himself to become the leader of the Soviet Union, and very closely, or very almost did. Once Stalin was dead, Beria, well, someone in charge of the secret police, he knew everything and everyone. He had people everywhere. However, everyone hated him. Even in the top echelons of the Politburo, the Communist Party, everyone, well, they were terrified of him, but they also despised him. And what they did, they had a kind of mini coup, Khrushchev and the rest of them. They brought in a Soviet general because they were too cowardly to do it themselves, and the Soviet general took out a pistol, put it between Beria's eyes, and pulled the trigger right in front of them, blew his brains out, and for many years, many Soviet citizens didn't actually know he was dead. They thought he'd just been sent off to exile in Siberia. He was shot right there in the Kremlin. An ignoble end to an ignoble man. In 1956, Khrushchev, being very slow in the uptake, decided to forgive the peoples that had been expelled from their homelands by Stalin. This included the Chechens and the Ingush. The Tatars of Crimea were forgiven, but not allowed to go back into Crimea in large numbers until Gorbachev's era, actually. But they were forgiven by the Soviet state. In 1957, finally, the Chechens were allowed to go back to their homes, bit by bit. And most of them did, although there's quite a few Chechens still in Kazakhstan. And they eventually became the majority once again. And now, Chechnya is still a part of the Russian Federation. It has been crushed twice by the Russians since the fall of the Soviet Union. Chechens are still a fearsome people. And, well, that is our story. The deportation of the Chechen nation started on this day in 1944. If you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment.